I said, well, how many people here ever been to a rodeo? And about 40% of the class raised their hand. And I said, well, can you picture a bull behind the gate and a chute at the rodeo? There I was, at the age of 22. I said, and somebody opened the gate. The bull came jumping out into the arena in all different directions. I said, I didn't have a business plan, you know? I didn't have any money. I had $500 maybe that I'd saved. But I said I had a whole lot of idealism. And I said I had a terrible need to succeed. And I had an equally terrible fear of failure. I'm Bill Butler, and I grew up here in Covington, Kentucky, and I'm still here. I was born in Kentucky, 14 blocks south of here. I had a full family. I had 7 brothers and sisters. Dad was a self-made guy who went into the plumbing business during the Great Depression at the age of 22 because he couldn't find a job. Mother, she's the one that when we look back today that I remember more about things that she said. Like, put that in your pipe and smoke it. You know, if you couldn't find something, she would say, well, if your head weren't connected by your neck, you'd lose it too, you know. But the big thing she said that stuck, she said that when you're 18, you're on your own. And I'll bet she said that from the time I was 5 years old. Love was not a word that we heard. It was about work and success. All my dad ever wanted was for his son to grow up and play football at St. X High. And so I was lucky. I took the test and I got in, and I went out for football. I didn't know anything about football. And they didn't have a football field. They didn't have any campus. And so after school, you'd suit up in the football uniform, and they would drive for 40 minutes or so to a place down on the river where there was a big open field, and that's where we'd practice. But then you had to, at the end of that practice, get back to the headquarters of school, and then I had to get from school to home, and the first thing they told you when you entered St. Xavier High School was, if you don't study 4 to 4.5 hours a night, you're not going to make it here. So it was just too much. And I came home and told my dad I dropped off the football team. And my sister later in life told me about a very loud situation in the house at the time. And she said it was like he wrote you off. Well, I think he did. I was 13, 14 years old, and I had to pay my own way the second, third, and fourth year. But I never questioned leaving there. I had a paper route in grade school. I got $4 a week, I think, for doing that, and I saved almost all of it. And I had I'll never forget, I had $240 in that savings account, and tuition was $225. So that covered the second year. And then I had 3 jobs, junior and senior year, all at the same time, doing different things, including being a busboy. And that's how I paid for the third and the fourth years. So I'm in my last year. Dad ended up building a good-sized commercial plumbing business where I was at his plumbing shop, which was a big place, and I was cleaning things up. And I was marking the bins a 3/4 by 1/4 by 1-inch T. It was in the afternoon after school, and he came in to the room and saw what I was doing, and he lost it at the top of his voice. And he said, "This is my business, and you're not going to take it away from me." My dad died at 59. When those incidents happened, I want to say he was about 52 or 3, and he died of Alzheimer's. One of the side effects or symptoms is people emotionally get angry. I think if he hadn't been ill, he never would have said those things. But he did, and it set my course in life. Because by the time I got out of Ohio College of Applied Science with my engineering, I didn't want to be in the plumbing business. I wanted to build buildings. And I was moving down that road. So at a time when my dad was ill, so I couldn't sit down and just talk to my dad. But Al Lubrecht and I would sit there. He had this big stuffed chair, leather in his office, and he'd sit behind the desk. And I'd sit in that chair, and it might be a Saturday morning, and we might talk for 2 hours. He was very encouraging to me about who I could be, what I could be, that kind of thing. I remember once talking to him. I was riding with him in a car, and I said, "I am so impatient." And when Al talked, he sometimes used that finger. And he'd say, "Don't confuse impatience with ambition." And I never forgot that. But he meant a lot. It was, at the time, probably very much needed. When I was 21, I had a major, a spiritual encounter. And I crossed a line in prayer on the question, would you turn your whole self over to the mission of Christ? And I had this incredible explosion of light in my brain, and I was just filled with energy and joy and peace and love, and all at the same time. It's something people can't understand unless they've been there. So that's when I came to realize that my life in God began again, because I couldn't see my life for the first 21 years. As I tell you this story about the light, I have the light. It never leaves. It goes down. But if I tell the story, there's the light. When I went into business, I was 22. I wanted to build buildings. Everybody knew that I had never built a building, right? When you're out of town, you're an expert. In your local town, everybody knows you're not. I went to Louisville, Kentucky, and I hired a guy 45 years old. So I'm about 25. He's 45. And I got it right the first time. He was a salesman. And we built some big buildings. We built things from California to Boston, Chicago, Florida. We've covered the coast. And a big bottling plant for Stitzel Weller Distillery. Old Pappy Van Winkle. I knew Pappy Van Winkle. And I was 29 years old, 30 years old, but they didn't know it. But back in those days, there was no internet. You couldn't check a guy out very easy, see? And the proposals looked very professional. And we got the jobs. I know one thing makes the person who they are, makes the person do the things they did. In my case, it was a quest for success. My wife, for years, when we were young, married, and we'd go to the Chamber of Commerce meeting and she'd meet somebody. Well, nobody knew us. And they would say, well, what's your husband do? And she said, excuse me. She would say, he dreams dreams and follows them. And so when you ask the question, well, what was it that propelled you? Where did all that energy come from? Why do you do the things you do in the community or for the poor? I made a commitment. And knowing that I was going in business, so all of a sudden, now I got a problem. Over here, I've just made this commitment to the mission of Christ, and over here, I'm committed to this capitalistic activity. Now that's a problem. See? So what's the solution to that problem? I came to the conclusion that they had to both be woven together. We have a little book on a company's culture. It's called Make No Little Plans. But the theme of it is that a corporation can be more than a financial enterprise. And if it can be, it should be. I was always one to protect the downside. If I were going to give advice to young people today, it's that. If you're an entrepreneur, protect the downside. All right? Reach, stretch, go for the brass ring, but cover the downside. Entrepreneurism isn't for everybody. It's either in your DNA or it isn't. You know, I know a lot of universities teach entrepreneurism. Good luck. If you're risk adverse by nature, this isn't for you. If you're not able to kind of commit your whole self night and day, you know, it's not for you. But if you go look at all the major changes that happen in most communities, changes for the future, the progress, you'll find an entrepreneur behind it. It seems to be part of the DNA, to be part of the community, to give back, to make things, to change things. I don't think any entrepreneur has a choice. Unless it's a choice not to follow these feelings or these visions. Either it's in you or it isn't. If it's in you, it's going to find its way. I think my whole life's that way. It's been kind of fun. When looking back, wasn't always fun along the way, but looking back, you know.